Good morning. How's everybody doing? Woo! Okay, it's great that you're here in the very first session of the day. You go.
Welcome, everybody.
Okay.
I'm Matthew Weise, and this is Clara Fernndez-Vara, and we're here to present the Narrative Innovation Showcase.
So we are game writers, game designers. We've been doing this for a long time now. And basically, we wanted to talk about experimentation in narrative. Because when we talk about game experimentation, people think about mechanics. And at times, the storytelling, the narrative is set aside. And we wanted to actually focus on the kind of work that people are already doing. We want to explore new forms of storytelling in games that also happen alongside design. There are people who are already doing it, and we want to highlight this kind of work. All the games that our creators are going to talk about today come from a variety of backgrounds, from academic experiments to experimental narratives to commercial games. So we have a nice range that we wanted to showcase and show that this is already taking place.
So one of the reasons we wanted to do this is because game narrative has been around for a really long time. It's been around since the beginning of games. And there's talks all the time at GDC and other events where people are always trying to say, we learned this thing, we just discovered this new thing, and it's true, new innovations happen all the time, but we also really need to build a strong understanding of where we've been so we can understand where we're going. So we really want to use this as like the beginning of the building of a real shared knowledge on this topic.
Mm-hmm. So the format is going to be, we have selected 5 speakers for you. They're going to give 5 talks, 10 minutes each, focusing on challenges in narrative design. And the focus is going to be on process, how they tackle that challenge. And there's not going to be Q&A. We're going to go to the wrap-up room so that we have plenty of time to cover the topics that we want to cover.
And our first speaker is Samantha Gorman talking about Prai.
Hello, everyone. Hello. So I'm Samantha. I'm one half of the collaborative duo Tender Claws. We've been working together for 10 years, and we write, design, code, film, basically do a lot of different hats on our projects. All our projects argue that the way a story is told and interacted with is actually part of the story itself. So today I'm going to be talking about Prai. Prai is part book, part film, and part game. It was a finalist for IGF, Excellence in Narrative, last year, and Apple nominated it as one of the top 25 apps of 2015.
You never speak of her. I picture her between us, right before it hit. Sometimes she looks back at me. Then nothing. A wet red pain, a spade slicing like a knife, a hand reaching.
Cool. So Prai is a character study. It's an internal character study that's set during a specific time, mainly the First Gulf War. The player is a guest inside James's mind, and through the use of the iconic pinch gesture, pries apart his memories and thoughts. So coming from an art background, we're like, okay, as directors, video is more consumed on a timeline by directors' authors, where text is often consumed on the reader's pace. So how do we integrate the passive and active and text and video in a meaningful and compelling way? How can we merge text elements in gameplay that feels integrated, that keeps player agency, and moves away from the cutscene or DVD extra? And what we saw, we're familiar with the background of full motion video for games, but this project was actually inspired by the ebook. Originally, ebooks were like future of the book, but then they were adapting print conventions such as the page turn, and a lot of media was very segmented rather than integrated. We really pay attention to the medium of the platform we're working with. So tablets are excellent devices for video consumption. However, a lot of early projects were simple branching narratives where the branches weren't necessarily weighted in a satisfying way. They didn't go to a conclusion that's felt satisfying for me as a reader. And Prai's story was actually going against branching because it was really a process of someone coming to terms with their memories and the idea of the reader drilling deeper instead of branching outward. So how do we integrate text and video? We usually do a two-pronged approach. First, we think about the story. Okay, what does the story suggest? It's a character that's losing its sight. It's forcing open. It's coming to terms with something. There's an exchange of control. Then we think about the medium, the iPad. What are the basic gestures, the vocabulary, the ways of interacting that can be used for storytelling? So combining those, as well as bringing different knowledge from different disciplines like theater, film, and installation, we came up with different models to integrate text and video in ways that we felt were more meaningful. One of the first ideas, we kind of have this idea of the sympathetic gesture, where the player is a privileged guest inside the mind, and the player's actions and character's thinking are intertwined. So the character gets a Braille Bible inherited from his mother. If the reader, our player...
There were indeed twins in her womb.
Moves their finger smoothly over the text, the associations that the character has with their family.
Indeed, twins in her womb.
Is more static, it comes up. Whereas
the first one came out red looking.
If the reader moves their finger slower, then they get separate associations with their family during the war. In this way, we're able to remix the character's memories of his families according to this text that's relevant to the story. At a certain point in the climax of the narrative, he actually gets he's trying to tell himself a story of what happened in the past, but he's an unreliable narrator. At any point, the reader can pinch open different lines and they'll get information. He'll go back on what he said or give alternative versions. If it gets to a point where he can't conceptualize the text anymore, he'll get fragmented thoughts or like kind of frantic pace of thoughts. Or images of video will open up that are associative with the text he's encountered. There's about 45 minutes of video in this chapter alone. And finally, we wanted something that unlocked throughout as the reader went through the project. And here, there's an album that James encounters that's destroyed during the war. It holds the memories of his mother and one of his friends, Jesse, in the pages. But what remains are only obsessive thoughts of what the objects once were on the page. If the reader scrolls fast, the objects become whole again. Otherwise, on the large level, it's description of literally what was on the page, or on the smaller level, memories or associations with the objects. So these are some ways we tried to combine text and video and have a system where we had very authored, controlled aspects where I'm controlling what the lines say, I'm controlling the order, but at any point the player can dig in and get more information. It's very exploratory. So these are the principles that guided us through Prai, and I can actually highlight it in some of these mechanics. One of the central mechanics of the story is this eye-open chapter, where the violence of the pinch gesture forces the eyes open, but at any point in the timeline, the player can do this. Closing the eyes will return to a default space where the thoughts update on what was just seen. But however, there is a third layer to this, where there's three spaces, where an inverse pinch will crunch down and it'll get more subconscious memories and thoughts. And these three spaces work together. However, we as authors have used a timeline to plan out everything that happens according to time code, where we can take the time code and without the player necessarily realizing it, manipulate it to make sure they see certain story beats while leaving other moments exploratory. For instance, we can, if we want them to see like something that happens further on and they close the eyes, we can make sure that the external world video pauses, but the sound continues, so they feel like they're in a continuous world. so that when they open the eyes next, immediately that story beat hits. There's a very complicated system in how we actually author the underlying structure to make sure that we're creating a cohesive narrative while still leaving open the exploratory mechanic. One of the things we're also interested in is there's times when we invert the idea of text at a player's pace and video at an author's pace. What happens to text when it becomes video? What is watching and what is reading? So the last slide is changing game narrative is not necessarily the goal here. It's the evolution of game narrative is not one conclusion, but a rich variety of approaches. Instead, we argue for deeper attention to how interactions and story itself resonate. That story doesn't exist in a vacuum. It originates from player and author effect and a combination of passive and active viewing. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Aaron Reed, talking about Icebound.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron A. Reed. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and also an independent designer. But I am graduating soon, so this second part becomes more important. So I've been making indie story games for more than 10 years now. You might recognize one or two of these things. I've always been really trying to push at the boundaries of what interactive stories can do. I'm going to talk today about my latest game, the Icebound Concordance. So we had this on the festival circuit last year. It was here at IGF, and we actually won Indiecade's Story Award last year, which was a huge honor. And I wanted to say that this is really a true collaboration made equally by myself and Jacob Garby, who I think is not here today, but is going to be around GDC. So if you see him, say hi. So the narrative premise we set out to explore with this game was this. What if exploring an interactive story could feel like sculpting with clay? Because the choice structures we're used to in game stories tend to fall into one of two imperfect categories. So branching paths can feel kind of like being lost in a maze. You can't see the structure or where you're positioned in it. And that makes choices feel stressful because you can't see the consequences of them. What decisions will lead to the best story, you usually don't know, and you can't usually try again without starting over from the beginning. Mazes are also static. You'll never do something that surprises the designer of the maze. Mazes are also hard to build for the designer because you might waste your time building paths no one ever sees, but in practice this usually isn't a problem because most mazes are fake in games, as we all know. There's usually only one real path through the story. And collapsing branches is fine. I do this all the time in my work, so do all of us. But it's a trick. And so with this project, we really wanted to think about alternatives to that. So another technique we often see in interactive stories feels sort of like customizing options in your new car, right? So you're offering decisions to the player that might have a cosmetic effect or might get aggregated into stats that the game refers to later on. But these kind of decisions don't usually change the shape of the overall experience very much. And so this works too. And again, I do this all the time in my games. But sometimes not even the new car smell can hide the fact that maybe this isn't the car you would have picked out for yourself. You're kind of stuck with it. And maybe it's even more of a railroad car than one that you can actually drive around to explore in on your own. So this sense of exploring is really what Jacob and I wanted to try with this game. What's a different model that really puts exploring as a mechanic, as the thing you're doing, front and center. Genuinely exploring a story space. And the story part of that is important too, because we're both writers, so we didn't want something that felt so procedural or generative that it stopped working as fiction. So our challenge was to find a new narrative mechanic and build a game around it that allowed low-cost reversible decisions and the ability to make surprising things. So that's kind of what we mean by feeling like sculpture. So for extra fun, we had some constraints. We initially did this project for an art grant called Future of the Book that wanted a digital game that worked with a physical printed book, which is right here, and which we also designed along with the game. As writers without a budget, it needed to be mostly driven by text, and also this. So we had some interesting constraints that might be different than the constraints many of you work with on your games. So let me talk a little bit about the game we ended up with, and then I'll go back and say how we sort of tackled these challenges. So in the Icebound Concordance, you explore a series of connected stories set at a place called Chironis Station, a polar research base slowly sinking into ice. Each level of the game is a deeper level of Chironis Station and a story further back in time of people who lived at this remote outpost. As you reach each new story, you see a map for that level of the station. The map is filled with objects and areas that might become significant to the story if you choose to shine one of your virtual spotlights on them. And we kind of like to call this idea Chekhov's Dollhouse. So if you know the theater convention that if there's a gun over the mantelpiece, someone's going to shoot it before the end of the play, in our game, you're sort of choosing what narrative element has that significance. What setups will lead to dramatic payoffs in your version of the story. And I should say that the set of possibilities on each map isn't static. It's in part procedural, chosen from a library of content and winnowed down in part by the player's earlier choices. So certain combinations activate more story fragments, which you're seeing on the left side here, events and endings. These are second and third act style plot points implied by the setup you've created. So, for example, loneliness plus romantic thoughts might lead to a love story, but then if you add an element of danger, it might give it a tragic ending. All three kinds of story fragments can also be examined as longer texts, which are altered based on the current state of the story, such as other active fragments, recurring themes, and so on. There's also shimmering text that can be cycled through different alternatives. And sometimes a single word can really profoundly change the meaning of an entire fragment. So while all this is happening, you carry on a running conversation with a sort of digital ghost, the original author of all these stories, who's been resurrected as a virtual agent. To resolve a story, you need to convince the author that your version makes sense. You do this by showing him pages from the companion physical book, the Icebound Compendium. Filled with more layers of narrative, the book acts as a kind of thematic controller for the story. Augmented reality recognizes which page of the book you're looking at, and hidden tags determine whether a given page and your chosen story have any overlapping thematic ideas. If they do, those themes become strengthened, and the next level you visit will have more objects and text connecting to those strengthened themes. As you go deeper, you're slowly bringing the narrative more and more in line with your own thematic preferences, making the story feel more and more like something you contributed to. So that was a lot to take in, but the core gameplay loop is really kind of just this. You're building stories using a set of available fragments. You're resolving stories by finding a page in the book with a thematic match. And then that set of fragments gets winnowed down based on those decisions so that the next story you build has more fragments that connect to the themes you're interested in. So how did we get to here? What was the solution to our initial challenge of wanting something that felt more sculptural? Well, it turns out we took a couple of significant ideas. So rather than invent one giant system that could create the aesthetic we wanted, we realized we needed to make the story dynamic in a lot of different subtle ways. So on the highest level, choosing themes via showing the book pages helps shape the story in a big sense. What's it about? What's the big picture? The mechanic of moving the lights around controls the sort of major details, which characters you're going to focus on, what plot events are important. And then that zoomed-in view of the individual texts gives you the player control over really small aspects, words and phrases. And at the same time this cycle is going on, there's also things like the conversation with the central character who has a state that can change, and how the player chooses to interact with the printed book. Do they read it all at once at the beginning? Do they dip back into it as they're playing? So together, all these things really worked better than any one system for creating a dynamic that made the player really feel like an author. And one of the things we've been happiest about is to see this come out in reviews of the game. So we got, a few weeks ago, this really nice piece from Rock, Paper, Shotgun where they said, "I'd feel some small but significant change ripple through the game from a choice I'd made. The Icebound Concordance is a game that more than anything else captures this feeling of editing." So that's been really cool to see people pick up on that. We also did a lot of paper prototyping of narrative mechanics, which is cool, and you don't get to do that often. We did a lot of experimenting with ways we could break story up into pieces, move those pieces around, combine them, and importantly, restrict those combinations so that they stayed narratively valid without restricting the player's creativity so much that they felt railroaded. Another insight, when exploring a new space, you need a map. So we built a lot of visualization and authoring tools to help us understand the kind of huge combinatorial space representing the different ways our story fragments can be combined. And this is actually a doubly exponential space because each level has thousands of possible sets of fragments based on what themes are active, but each of those sets has hundreds of permutations based on how the player has currently configured their lights. So the tools we built really helped us discover how much content we needed to cover that possibility space and to find any holes or edge cases that might have taken weeks of playtesting to emerge more organically. And another interesting insight, we actually needed less content than we originally thought we did. So Icebound has about 50,000 words of story, and that's smaller than other projects I've done by a significant amount. But we've seen in reviews and in playtesting and stuff that players feel more like they're actually shaping the story and having a big impact on it, which is a huge win for two overworked writers. So how does this change game narrative as we know it? And sorry, Clara, that makes me think of this. So I think I have less grandiose conclusions than a Star Trek episode, but I think Jacob and I actually kind of succeeded at what we set out to do. We genuinely didn't know if we could make this work, but we went out exploring strange new mechanics and seeking out new models of interactive story, and we hit on something really special, I think. So if you're lucky enough to be in a space where you can explore an indie space, an academic space, a personal project space, even a studio willing to take some risks, you should be boldly going. The rewards might be fame or possibly even fortune, as illustrated by this photograph of Jacob and I holding literally $5s of dollars. So finally, I really believe that players are more engaged if they can build story, not just choose story. I've seen this in a lot of my own projects, and I'd love to see more people building story engines that let players truly collaborate with us, right? Let them use the storytelling skills that we all have as writers and narrative designers to help them tell their own surprising, life-changing, meaningful stories that they truly had a hand in crafting. So you can find out more about our game at ice-bound.com. The book is actually here at the GDC bookstore, which is awesome. And if you're interested in getting a hold of me, that's my website. Thank you very much.
And next up, we have Katie Chironis talking about Elsinore.
Hi. So I'm a game designer at Oculus by day and by night. Some friends and I work on Elsinore. Here's our trailer. So what is Elsinore? Elsinore is a time-looping Shakespearean adventure game set in the world of Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's really weird, and we're still honestly not sure how to elevator pitch it ourselves, so we're still working on that. It's kind of like if you took Hamlet and mashed it up with the time-looping mechanics of Majora's Mask and a little bit of performance, location-based theater like Sleep No More. As Ophelia, who, for those of you who slept through high school English, is Hamlet's ex and jilted lover, one of the side characters in the original play, you are attempting to stop the tragedy of Hamlet over the course of 4 days. There are two catches with this. Number one, Ophelia is stuck in a time loop, and she knows it. So all the information that she learns between loops is retained. And number two, the information that you do acquire sort of goes into this inventory of information that you have at your disposal, and you can then present it at any given point in the timeline. So, obviously, talking to characters about what your dad thinks has a very different impact on day one versus if he just got murdered by Hamlet. So working with that has been really interesting. In many ways, Elsinore is sort of born of what if. Most of us on the team work in game development for our day jobs, and we wanted to sort of explore this concept of tragic gameplay. And, you think of tragedy as sort of this concept of a group of characters or a tragic protagonist doing everything in their power to try and create a good outcome, but because of some innate flaw or some vice that they have, everything goes to shit. And so we really wanted to take the concept of the traditional, game, which is structured around this power fantasy, right? You're always supposed to be excelling and learning and gaining clarity and getting better. And how can we turn that on its head and create something that really feels like playing a Shakespearean tragedy? Accounting for player agency makes this really hard. We tend to try and turn things against players, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we managed to make that happen. Number one is that, giving players this arsenal of information at their disposal allows them to do completely reasonable things that Shakespeare didn't account for when he was writing Hamlet in the 17th century. So, for example, players go up to Hamlet and they're like, "Hey, Hamlet, I noticed that you're feeling really stabby today. What if you didn't kill anyone?" Or conversely, they go right up to Hamlet and they say, "Hey, Hamlet, I know for a fact that your uncle totally murdered your dad, so here's all the evidence you need. Go get him, tiger." And so, when you sort of allow players to attempt to solve the tragedy for themselves, the puzzle becomes, can they actually do it? It seems so straightforward, right? You look at Romeo and Juliet and you're like, what if they had a cell phone? Oh my God, this would have just cleared itself right up. And so writing to this and writing around this required digging really deeply into the source material and doing a lot of sort of reading about the original play. What do scholars think of it? What do scholars think of the characters? And creating large bodies of new information and new characterization that did not exist in the original play. So taking the example of Gertrude, again, for those of you who don't know Hamlet, she's the Queen of Denmark. For the most of the play, she's kind of a background character. She sits at her husband's side. She rules the throne. In Act 5, she gets poisoned and dies. And that's a large amount of her contribution to the play. But, she is still a queen and she's still on the throne. So what happens if the player goes and tells her on day one, "Hey, I have proof that your husband is a murderer and murdered your last husband," right? How would she react? And so it really required sort of going back and reading through the play and creating new avenues of content that move around that. Not to mention, because it's a time looping game, we can see Gertrude in so many different situations. We can see her at her peak and at her lowest point. We can see her when she's ruling on the throne of Denmark as a solo queen after having disposed of her husband, and when she's about to commit suicide because she learned something that she shouldn't have long before she was supposed to know it. And so really, the secondary struggle, once we had sort of created all this content around characters, was, okay, how do we bring it all to a nice close? How do we take everything that we know and create a tragic ending out of all of this? Because, if you sort of go with this theme of tragic gameplay, we're trying to force players into scenarios where all of their best intentions are thwarted, and the things that they thought would work out don't in the end. So a large amount of this comes back to sort of writing around each character's tragic flaw. We wanted to basically, the player will present information and characters will seem to move in rational ways according to that information until inevitably it starts to break down towards the end of day 3 and day 4. So a lot of day 3 and day 4, they start to go crazy, they start to kill each other, and in a way, it feels a little bit dirty as a game designer and a writer, because I will see players come in and play the game, and they're like, "Hey, everything was going really well," and then it totally veered off the rails and went out of control. And that's sort of the exact opposite of everything that you're taught to do in commercial game development, which has kind of been really fun. Watching the gameplay sort of feels like a back and forth between, myself and Connor, our designer, and the players as they're attempting every possible avenue that they think will lead to success. And at every step of the way, the game is saying, no, you can't do that. So in the end, we've sort of seen players come to an interesting conclusion, which is that, when you're reading a tragedy, the characters within the tragedy normally come to death or failure. But when you're watching players engage with the tragic game, they come to catharsis. They sort of realize, it's not about solving, it's not about winning, it's about understanding who these people are and who these characters are, and empathizing with them and trying to, befriend them in the face of the end of the world. And so, how does Elsinore change game narrative? I think that's a large question. To some extent, I don't know. As the writer and as the designer, it's not really my job to expound upon that. What I will say is that I think Elsinore works best as an outlier. I think it works best as, in a world where there are games that empower the player and lift her up and allow her to, excel and to gain new heights. Elsinore says, "Fuck you." And maybe there's some power in that. We are demoing the game at the Indie Mega Booth every day this week if you would like to come and play for yourself as writers and designers and tell us how we're doing. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Nina Freeman talking about Sybil.
Hello. Okay. So, hi, my name is Nina Freeman. I'm a level designer at Fulbright right now, working on Tacoma. My last project was Sybil, which I worked on with StarMade Games. And today I'll talk to you about vignette games, which is what Sybil is. Okay, so what's a vignette? I really like this definition of vignettes from Ian Bogost. I think it encompasses vignettes in the broadest sense, which is useful. Some examples of other vignettes, or vignettes in other mediums that are not games, are Mrs. Dalloway, if you've read that, much of William Carlos Williams' work, who's a poet, or the movie Lost in Translation. In games, some pieces that I consider vignettes are Dysphoria, The Last of Us Left Behind, or The Beginner's Guide. So just to give you some context about the kind of vignette that I'm talking about. So here's a short vignette-style poem, just to give you like a concrete example, by Frank O'Hara, which you can read. Much of my work is inspired by this kind of work in poetry, and particularly by this poet and the other poets that are considered part of the New York School of Poetry. In my work particularly, I've used vignettes as a guide to developing mechanics that enable the kind of intimacy that help players examine the wrinkles in individual human experiences. So the vignette games I designed are character-focused and focus on the specificity of human lives or moments in human lives. They don't often try to make a statement or have a theme, although they can. They're exploratory or descriptive of a single, concise experience or character. So I used this vignette approach when designing Sybil, a game that I worked on, like I said, with StarMade Games. I was the designer and writer. It's a game about a relationship between two young people, Nina and Blake, sort of in their late, like 19, early 20s. And they're two people who met in an MMORPG, like a World of Warcraft style thing, that want to meet up in real life to have sex. You play as Nina and experience this situation from her perspective. So it's a concise vignette game about this one particular moment in a larger relationship. And here's the trailer just to give you a sense of what the game is like and how it plays.
Morning.
What's up?
Not much. Want to do a run together?
Yeah.
I kind of wish we lived closer.
Yeah. Being on opposite coasts isn't the best for hanging out.
Would you want to meet up with me, like, in real life?
That's how you spell Sybil. People always ask me that, so that's how you spell it. It's already out. You can go to sybilgame.com if you want to check it out later. And it's in IGF. We'll be showing it on the expo floor later this week. So the challenge in making Sybil for me was that, you know, it's about this romantic relationship. And romantic relationships are full of complexity and nuance, as I'm sure most of us know. How do I tell the story of a relationship without overwhelming the player with information about, like, all these experiences that these people have had together? That's, like, a lot of stuff. So wait, I'm going to go back to the slide and stay on it for a bit. So when I started working on the game, I wanted to tell the story of this relationship, and it's based on a personal experience. So I had this whole deep, complicated memory that spanned over a few years, and that's a lot of story to tell, and I didn't necessarily want to tell all of it. The entire relationship between these two people has many aspects. How did they meet? What was that like? What have they bonded over? What have they fought over, etc. Making a story that addresses all of these things with depth and nuance would probably lead to a project of a larger scope than my team had the capacity for. 4 of us worked on it while I was in grad school, and we all had other jobs. So even more importantly, is every aspect of this relationship interesting to me as a writer? Potentially not. So I asked myself how I could focus on the aspect of the relationship that I found the most interesting to write about, and sort of like cut the scope down to that specific part of it in a vignette way. So in my effort to focus in on one aspect of the relationship, I developed the story within the constraints of a vignette. The vignette of Sybil focuses on the in-person meeting for sex between the two main characters. Given this constraint, each piece of the game needed to support and contextualize how and why the couple decide to meet up. Each act of the game consists of one conversation between the pair that contextualizes their meeting, and ephemera to support the player's understanding of that single moment in their relationship. So, of course, because it's a vignette about this one particular moment, the game does not start at the beginning of their relationship. It doesn't start like when they met. It starts sort of in the middle. So it doesn't depict that part of their relationship at all. It really just focuses in on this moment. So despite that, the players still need some context to understand that the relationship has already begun to develop, just for context. So throughout the first act, the players presented with ephemera that refer to their interactions sort of prior to this moment. For example, Nina's friend comments on how much she likes Blake in this email that the player can find. It's just enough information to show the player that Nina and Blake have already started down the path to becoming close, without spelling it out explicitly or exceeding the scope of the vignette. So it's really like sort of context building so they can understand where this relationship is coming from. So Act 1 continues to build on this basic level of information and begins to explore the physical side of Nina and Blake's relationship. The player finds pictures the two have been sending back and forth to each other while they overhear this flirtatious conversation in which Blake asks Nina for more pictures of herself. This act shows that the pair have become close enough to send real pictures of themselves to each other. And these photos and what they imply about how Nina and Blake are feeling are a really important wrinkle in this vignette of their oncoming sexual encounter. These photo exchanges show the player that the two are becoming intimate in a sexually charged way. So finally, the act ends with a short film of Nina taking a sexy selfie to send to Blake. This is meant to emphasize how important intimacy and the physical body are to this moment in Nina and Blake's relationship. So like I said before, each act is sort of meant to contextualize one sort of wrinkle in this moment. So this first one sets up sort of the sexual part of it. So, of course, all of this is conveyed to the player through emails and pictures and dialogue. It's almost like sort of a Gone Home style thing where you're like going through a space and looking at stuff and learning about the characters that way instead of having them like tell it to you explicitly. So it's all pretty minimal. I leave it up to the player to fill in the blanks. I give them just enough information in order to paint a picture of where this couple is at in their relationship without exceeding the constraints of the vignette by getting too much into sort of the history of it and the nitty-gritty of the stuff that came before this moment. So I think this is an important example of how the vignette as a constraint helped inform the mechanics and storytelling in Sybil. Vignettes are all about evocative detail, details that tell a story in between the lines, details that do not need to explain themselves or be spelled out. The player plays Sybil listening to the brief conversations between the characters and understanding the context of those conversations by finding ephemera that relate to them within the game's computer interface. So you're sort of listening to these conversations and understanding the context of them by clicking around Nina's computer and exploring all of this ephemera. So in Act 2, Nina and Blake are further breaking down the barriers between their digital and physical relationship as they come closer to having sex, because they are becoming emotionally intimate for the first time in this moment in their relationship. So in this act, the two are doing a lot more than sending pics to each other. It's no longer just about sort of the physical, like, sex aspect of the relationship. They're sharing intimate details about their lives. So in this conversation, for example, Nina tells Blake a story about how her mom and dad first met. And Blake tells Nina that he thinks she'd really get along with his real-life friends. So these are just, you know, the sort of things that you tell to someone when you're becoming intimate with them, these, like, personal stories. So finally, at the end of the act, it's clear that they're intimate enough to be thinking about what it'd be like to meet and to talk on the phone and to be sharing these more personal stories with each other, rather than, like, kind of just flirting and, like, sending sexy selfies to each other. Sort of another layer on top of that. So all of these little details that add depth to the vignette contextualize their awkward conversation in Act 2 that ends with them on the phone with each other. And when they're talking on the phone, they're sort of professing their love and desire for sex. Not because of the sexy pics, but because they feel like they understand each other in a way and are growing closer to one another at this moment in their relationship. So this act further contextualizes the vignette and gives the player a better understanding of how the meeting for sex came to be and how it developed to that point, and the details of their relationship that support that understanding. Okay, so finally, in Act 3, the player experiences the conversation between the couple that really ties up the vignette. Nina and Blake decide to actually meet. So Blake will fly to New York City to see Nina in person. But the act is about that and how the two feel about it. So it introduces some uncertainty, illustrating Blake's particular uncertainty about this meeting and Nina's enthusiasm. As you can see, her enthusiasm is sort of expressed by this list of potential plans on her desktop. That's sort of one of the first things you see in the act, so you can kind of see like, oh, Nina is off on her own, like kind of planning this out, and she's getting like pretty hyped up about it. And then that kind of contextualizes later in the act when she is really like, hey, we should meet, like, let's talk about this. I'm kind of already making plans. And you know that because you see her plans. So each act consists of one detail about their relationship that ultimately contextualizes the final short film, which closes this act. Nina and Blake meet up in person and have sex in this final short film that closes the final act of the game. The player's experience of that final scene is understood through the lens provided by the details of their relationship as evoked by the previous three acts. The sexy pics in Act 1, the phone calls in Act 2, and finally, the uncertainty in the plane tickets in Act 3. So, by the way, I would like to emphasize that all of this, I'm sort of explaining it in terms of the ephemera you find, because so much of that is there to really contextualize what's happening. It's really not just about the conversations. The conversations are so dependent on the player clicking around this computer and understanding what's going on in the background so that they can kind of feel like they know where Nina's coming from on a different level beyond just what she says. So, yeah. It's really about those details rather than a plot. There's not really much of a plot to this game. It's really just these three conversations and then they meet. It's as simple as that. It's about the characters and the nuance of the situation. It's about the snippets of conversations and the ephemera that contextualize them. This is what makes Sybil a vignette game. It's not told through an elegant beginning, middle, and end. It's one moment explored through the details that contextualize it. It's an ordinary life story told through ordinary life things. So the game does not explain the exact circumstances of this relationship that are not specifically relevant to helping the player's understanding of the focus of the vignette, which culminates sort of in that final short film where they meet up. The game begins in the midst of their relationship, like I said earlier. It explores how they came to meet up for sex and ends abruptly after this sort of sex meetup happens. I wasn't interested in exploring how the characters were impacted by what happened. That would be outside of the scope of the vignette. This vignette is constrained to the circumstances and nuances of exactly how it happened and nothing more. So the ending may feel unsatisfying because it ends at what many may consider the climax. However, the choice was deliberate in order to maintain the scope of the vignette and to evoke the character's feeling of a sudden end to a sexual encounter. The abrupt ending itself is necessary in order to express the ephemeral nature of this meeting between Nina and Blake. So I would like to emphasize that tying up your story neatly may not always be necessary. If abruptness evokes a feeling, use it. If the climax is the ending or the beginning, then make that decision purposeful and use it. If you're feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of a story, consider whether or not you're really just trying to explore one concise part of it, a vignette, and try to focus on that. Explore your story through its details, no matter how mundane. Don't be afraid to cut the cruft, even if it makes the story arc unusual. Every story has its own shape. Embrace it. Thanks.
And finally, we have Richard Rouse talking about The Church in the Darkness.
I want to thank Matt and Clara for inviting me to do this, and also thanks to all the other amazing talks we've had here today. I'm sort of intimidated by this lineup. But as the other speakers have talked about, when Matt and Clara proposed this session, they said, well, first state what your challenge was with the project. And I thought that was a really good thing to think of a project in those terms, and not enough projects maybe think about, like, what is the big challenge we're taking on with this game or with this project. And when I think a lot of really good directors do that sort of thing, but maybe they don't articulate it to themselves or write it down or anything like that. And I certainly didn't when I was starting this project. And when I thought back about when I started on this, on working on The Church in the Darkness, there were actually two challenges that I was taking on. And the first one was I really wanted to make an action game with a changing narrative. The reason I got into games was wanting to tell stories that would react to players and that would allow them to express themselves and to see what would happen. And I've had some success with that with games I've worked on in the past. Like the first game I made, Odyssey, was a Ultima-style RPG, to the suffering horror games where the choices you were making in the present not only affected the future but also the past. Or most recently, working a bit on State of Decay, where an ongoing simulation produces a lot of tricky narrative choices you kind of have to make under time pressure. But I was interested in some other games that I remembered back from way back. In the 80s, there were several murder mystery type games that actually randomized who was murdered in the game and who did the murdering. And this was sort of an interesting approach to adapting one of these things that made these games highly replayable. Or a more recent, but still 20 years ago, example, it comes from the Blade Runner game that Westwood did in the 90s, where it randomized whether each character was a replicant or not. And obviously the choices you would have to make as the player would change dramatically based on that. So the second thing I really wanted to do it was explore the nature of cults. And I've been sort of fascinated by cults for a long time, and specifically how cults often start off with these very noble intentions of really wanting to change the world or do something positive, and then, things sort of drift off and maybe go wrong. But maybe sometimes they don't, and why does it happen sometimes, and why does it not happen other times, and how can you tell? So the solution, of course, I realized was to combine these two things, and that's what I'm trying to do in The Church in the Darkness, which is the game we just announced, and I'm going to show the trailer.
We came to the jungle looking for peace.
America is corrupt. It sends our children to die in Vietnam. Its system keeps you poor, keeps you segregated, keeps you powerless.
We told you our way was better. Living in socialism as God intended. And because we preach the truth, they call us a cult.
So they hate us. They want to kill us. That is why we had to leave their sick country.
So we came here, to South America, to the jungle, to isolate ourselves, to purify our community. But still they hate us because our success proves that their society is wrong, that their system is cruel, that their way is doomed.
So they are coming for us. They will infiltrate us. They will sabotage us. They will try to kidnap our people.
But we are ready. We take up arms, and we will have no mercy for anyone that violates our home. Attacking us will just show the world how corrupt they are.
So let them call us a cult, because we stand firm for what we believe.
We have God on our side, and we will not let them take a single one of us alive.
So if I had to give you the one-liner, the Church in the Darkness is a top-down action infiltration game set inside a religious cult in the 1970s, where the story changes every time you play. The player is infiltrating this group, the Collective Justice Mission, to check on a relative. But the thing is, you don't know the true nature of this group. You don't know, are they a bunch of happy socialists just living their alternate life in the jungle, or is there something more apocalyptic going on? And the player has choice about how they interact with these people and what they do there. You can be completely stealthy in your infiltration, looking for the person you're trying to find. You can use sort of non-lethal methods to take down opponents, or you can kill anyone who gets in your way. So how did I come up with this? How did I get to this point and come up with this design? It really started with a lot of research. And, when I was prepping, I told Matt, well, maybe I don't need to talk about the research. And he was like, no, you should talk about the research. People need to do more research. So I love doing research, really going beyond just what you find in the Wikipedia article or, that cool movie you saw once with Denzel Washington in it. If you're on a budget like me, I recommend the library. They're still around. They're still awesome. Go find that dusty book in a quarter that no one has read and read it and put that stuff in your game. So when I was reading up on this, I found that the 70s were really the ideal time for this sort of radical, progressive group. In case the American education system has failed you, the 70s were a time of great sort of distrust of the government and uncertainty, like if our society was going to collapse at any time. We had the ongoing struggles in Vietnam and illegal bombings in Cambodia. You had ongoing fear of nuclear annihilation. And people were really not sure if society was going to make it. And they started thinking, well, the peaceful protest movements of the 60s have kind of failed us. And some people started actually going about things differently and threatening violence, and some actually carrying it out. And so in this time period is this very fertile period for these groups that were presenting a new way of life, a new way to approach having society that would work better. And the interesting thing in reading up on all of these groups that I found was that you don't join a cult because you're weak. You join it because you're really strong, because you're really strong-willed, that you want to do something different, that whatever we're doing right now is clearly not working, and I need to try something else. And these groups generally offer really great benefits to the people who are in them, like help them with their personal issues or help them find a community if they're outcasts. And they also then tend to start to involve this us versus them mentality, that we're right and everyone else is wrong, and you need to be with us. And the darker groups take that even farther, saying, well, if you ever leave us, we're never going to talk to you again. Your children are never going to talk to you again. We may hunt you down and persecute you, right? And the leaders of these groups tend to take the power that comes with leading this movement, and the absolute power corrupting absolutely happens. And sometimes bad outcomes happen, but sometimes they don't. Interestingly, reading about so many of these groups, they don't all end badly. Sometimes they just try something for a while and then it peters out. Or sometimes, some of these groups are still going today, but they don't get the headlines because, no crimes were committed and everyone didn't die. So, looking, it wasn't intended to be funny. I'm sorry. Looking at how to put this into game form, I thought, well, the player needs to be an outsider. He needs to look at this group from the outside in order to try to figure out which type of group is this. Is it one that is just trying to do their own thing, or is something, something bad going to happen? And you can think of it like one of those murder mysteries, except the murder has not taken place yet, if the murder is going to happen at all. So I thought an infiltration game was something that fit, because I wanted to build on a bedrock of sort of known gameplay mechanics and things that I've worked with in the past. Unlike some of these other talks when I'm innovating, I like to keep some stuff like that I'm familiar with and innovate in a few ways. Because I'm conservative in that way, I guess. I wanted something that felt like a good immersive sim that we've played many versions of that infiltration game before, but that everything was completely grounded in reality, that stripped away sort of the sci-fi trappings or the fantasy trappings we've seen in other games in the genre. And where the player's choices in that world really have an impact on what happens. And I wanted you to soak up the narrative while you were playing. You're listening to the cult leaders talk over the PA system the entire time you're infiltrating their movement. And what they say changes subtly based on which type of group this is. And you're finding documents and reading them and trying to put together which type of group is this. Because the interesting thing about all these different groups, as I researched them, was that there is a great commonality to them. There is a lot of the dogma they say is the same. So a lot of the base of the game is the same, and then these little bits along the edges change, and it's your job as the player to seek those out and try to figure out what they are. So I thought, and then obviously you have a choice about what to do with the information as you get it. And, you can think of it like this. We've all played choice-based games before where you have a baseline narrative and then players make some choices and then you have a number of possible stories that can result from that. But if you think of the game as having several starting narrative states that are change every time you play the game, you then put your choices on that, and then you have a much bigger possibility space for all the player stories that can be created. And that was something that excited me about working on this game. So the final question they posed to all of us was, how does this evolve game narrative? And that was a very highfalutin question, particularly for a game that is the farthest from shipping of any of these. But since they asked, I like to think that each storytelling medium that we all know and love, they each do something really well. So, for example, books are really good, novels are really good at putting you inside the head of a given character, putting you in with, that one person and their innermost thoughts. Comics take the written word and add a illustrative level, that makes everything much more, have a specific style and tone to it that's unique. Theater is great because I think it's the most human, because the people are right there acting in front of you, going through this whole scene, and you're right there living it with them. And film is obviously in complete control of the experience, the framing, the lighting, the music, everything can be exactly what the director wants it to be. So I think games can be a lot of different things, but the thing that excites me about them the most is I think that we can ask the question, what if, right? What if the situation was like this? What would you do then? How would your choices change? How would that impact everyone else in the game? What if your family member was in a religious cult, but you didn't know whether that cult was really bad or not? What if you found out the group was apocalyptic? Would you save, your own family member, or would you risk it all and try to save the whole group? What if the group had no bad intentions, but you still thought they were kind of creepy? Would you let your relatives stay there? And I think, with subject matter like this, I think it's really valuable to explore it in games because we can see more sides of the story. Because looking at the story of all these cults, there's not just one. And I read so many stories of survivors and people who have left who say, it's not as simple as everyone thinks. We wanted to change the world. We weren't brainwashed. There was good along with the bad. What if things had gone a different way? And I think those are the interesting different sides to the story. And telling a linear story of this, you can only tell one version of that. But telling it in game form, you can look at multiple sides of it and show some more of the complexity. And, the player can make choices about how they deal with it and see just how many sides there are to any one story. So that's the game. If you want to follow along with development as we continue to work on it, I've got a mailing list up at the website there, or get on Twitter or something like that. If you come by after, I have some cool postcards you can take with you. And I'm doing another talk about dynamic narratives tomorrow at 2:10 if you want to hear that's more broadly about a whole bunch of different games. All right, thanks very much.
All right, so I hope that you were all taking notes because that was a lot of information and there's been a lot of insights, but we wanted to give you a bit of a summary of the things that we've learned today from listening to them, but also from our conversations while we were preparing this. So the first thing that we realized is that all of the talks here deal with games that go beyond genre fiction. And I mean by genre fiction things like science fiction, fantasy, mystery, and I love those, but I think that going beyond genre fiction, looking at histories of real people, going to Shakespeare, cults of the 70s, they're going to challenge us in the ways that we have to tell those stories, that we have to create those stories. So just by shifting to something that is not genre, we're already innovating and finding new ways to tell those stories.
Also, fragmented modular narratives, the vignettes that we were talking about before, are a great way to tell a story. We tend to think of plot as being that's what a story is, but really there's many kinds of stories that are just little bits of information that you can arrange in any way or come across in any way, and this is actually not a strange way of telling a story. This is a very normal way of telling a story when you think about poetry and other forms, and it fits in games very well, and we often don't take advantage of it, and it's a pretty simple thing to do in a lot of ways.
I mean, in a way, you're going to see, actually in the Narrative Summit, there's a couple of talks about branching narratives, and in a way, we have to think beyond branching. We're looking at combinatorics, we're looking at ways in which we can create new stories, which links to the next point that we want to make, which is leaving gaps. And at times, leaving gaps are ways to encourage players to interpret the game, to explore, to find out what else is there, to figure out the story for themselves. And in a way, what we do is less storytelling and more story building. We are building the story from those modules that we were just talking about, but also we invite players to build their own stories by exploring the gaps that we're leaving for them. For them.
And surprise, video's not terrible. We just did it wrong 20 years ago. You can use video or in a broader sense, static media, and still have rich, interactive experience. It's just a matter of approaching it in the right way.
So that's it from us. You'll get emails from the GDC organization asking you to fill out the evals. Please tell us nice things about us. If you want to see more of this next year, we'll be happy to come back and find more experimental narrative games for you. There's no Q&A, but we'll be happy to meet you at the wrap-up room on this floor, all right? Thank you, everybody, and a round of applause for all the